how would somebody know if it's time to start exploring getting divorced? Because that's a question I get a lot, and I always feel like I cannot answer. But what guidance, like, what do you say to people that come to you and they're like, should I divorce?
Yeah, it's so complicated and complex, and there are so many things that factor into that decision. But one thing that I consistently say is that if the restoration of the marriage contributes to or leads to the destruction of the person, then it is time to think about leaving.
Mm.
We were created. God did not create us tied to another person. Yes, he said it's not good for man to be alone, but that wasn't just talking about marriage. It was talking about our need for community and journeying through life together. And when you are in a relationship that is destroying you as an individual, that is not what God intended when he created marriage. So you think about Jesus in the temple, right? When he came in and they had the money changers in there and they were doing all sorts of things that defile the temple. Jesus comes in and he starts, turning over tables and saying, this is supposed to be a house of prayer, right? He was about restoring what God intended.
Hmm.
And when you have a marriage that does not reflect what God intends, where there's abuse and repeated adultery, and I'm talking about all kinds of abuse. We know with physical abuse, it's like, yes, but we cannot underestimate what emotional and psychological abuse can do to
Hmm.
destroy a person. So when a person is being destroyed, when the beauty that God intended to be reflected with Christ in the church is not exemplified in a relationship, then it is time to think about getting out.
Okay, but say what you said in the very beginning. It was like when the restoration of the marriage leads to the
Leads to,
destruction of the
of the
person. I
person.
really liked what you
I
said
like
there.
that.
And also, I love how you touched on the abuse part because, um, you know, so many people say, well, if it was abuse or an all in all out flesh affair, I'd have permission to leave. And you just touched on that so beautifully that abuse is not just physical. It's not, it's not just verbal. There's psychological, emotional,
That is very good. And but that goes back to I think that a lot of women they don't know that. They don't know that what's happening to them or what's happening in their marriage is abuse. And I've been in group with women and people are sharing their stories and you can even see it on their face when they get to a point where they're like, "Well, that happens to me, but I never put it in that
hmm
context." And I know I probably have shared this before, but and I was really young when I first heard this, but there was a woman I was visiting some friends and a woman came by and she was going through a really nasty divorce, a Christian, and she said her comment was, "Well, I just thought that all husbands hit their wives, because my dad hit my mom. And so when I got married and he
mm
started hitting me, I just thought, well, this is marriage. This is what it looks like." And so I think that there's a piece of this that women don't necessarily recognize what other types of divorce, what other types of abuse, what that looks like.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. There's something called the power and control wheel, which is very helpful. It lists all the different types of abuse that exist. And it's something I like to use with my clients. I pull it up with them because some people are, who wants to be an abuse victim?
Yeah.
Right.
Nobody. Nobody wants that label. But when you start to pull up and you show, okay, this is what is considered psychological abuse, this is what is considered emotional abuse, here's what's considered spiritual abuse, and you take away the, hey, this is about you, but like, no, here's what the research has shown. And do you see any of these reflected in your relationship? It's very eye-opening,
hmm
especially for women, because to your point, most of us have probably experienced abuse growing up, but it wasn't called that, right? So when you've had a situation in your home, abuse can be normalized.
hmm
And it's important that if we're going to help people be healed and whole, that we really equip them with the language and
Yes.
understanding of what abuse is.
we need to point out that men can be in an abusive relationship too, which I know, I'm sure you can agree that it's just very underreported, because I
Yes.
was in a phone call recently with a male partner that, you know, it's like, okay, you realize this is what's going on. You know, we have our abuse inventory and our betrayal and beyond material, which really, again, is eye-opening. And I feel like I always have to prep the women, especially if they have, you know, pretty decent, non-abusive in all areas kind of husbands. And then I'm like, okay, the reason why we're going through this is because I never want to assume somebody doesn't have abuse. And so I kind of just like set the tone that I just want you to be aware of all forms, whether it applies to your husband or somebody else. That, you know, just to make you aware. But every time after they go through, they're like, I had no idea there was so many check marks, because it almost goes hand in hand with addiction, where there's going to be some kind of abuse, of whether it's financial or intellectual, being told you don't know what you're talking about, you're being paranoid, you're being overprotect, or, you know, you're jumping, you're acting crazy, you know, and basically telling somebody not to trust their own instinct. That's a form of intellectual